What lies beneath America's most infamous prison? During routine renovations at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, workers break through the concrete floor to discover something impossible: a meticulous arrangement of human remains and carved stones that predate any known settlement of the island. As archaeologist Elena Vasquez documents the find, government agents swiftly move to contain the site. The evidence suggests contact between European explorers and indigenous peoples centuries before official history acknowledges. A discovery with the power to rewrite America's origin story. But powerful forces are determined to keep these secrets buried, regardless of the cost. As Elena uncovers layers of historical deception built into the very foundations of Alcatraz, she faces an impossible choice: preserve her career or expose a truth that was never meant to be found. What began as an archaeological discovery quickly becomes a desperate race against those who will stop at nothing to control the past. Because Alcatraz wasn't built to keep prisoners in, it was built to keep history buried. The metallic crash shattered the morning silence like a gunshot. In an instant, what had been routine renovation work inside the cold walls of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary transformed into something else entirely. The concrete floor, poured decades ago to entomb whatever lay beneath, had given way under the jackhammer's assault. A perfect black circle gaped where solid ground had been moments before. Martin Reeves, site foreman of the restoration project, felt his stomach tighten as he approached the edge. 20 years in construction had taught him what to expect beneath old buildings: forgotten pipes, foundation stones, perhaps the occasional rat's nest. What he saw instead made his coffee-bitter breath catch in his throat. "Everyone back," he ordered, voice barely audible over the still-running generator. The workers didn't move, their faces pale in the harsh work lights as they stared down into the darkness. Bones, human bones, not scattered randomly as one might expect from a forgotten burial, but arranged with meticulous precision. Even from above, the pattern was unmistakable. A perfect circular formation of skeletal remains, with skulls positioned at precise intervals, facing inward. Between them lay flat, carved stones, with markings too deliberate to be natural erosion. "Jesus Christ," whispered Miguel, the youngest worker, crossing himself involuntarily. The gesture seemed to break the paralysis gripping the crew. They retreated from the hole as if it might expand and swallow them whole. The dust from the collapsed concrete hung in the air, catching the slanting morning light that streamed through the prison's barred windows. Outside, seagulls wheeled across the San Francisco Bay, their cries suddenly seeming mocking rather than melancholic. "Nobody touches anything," Reeves said, pulling out his phone with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. "And not a word about this to anyone, understood?" The men nodded, but their eyes kept returning to the hole, as if magnetized by the macabre display beneath. One of them attempted a nervous laugh that died halfway through, morphing into something closer to a cough when he noticed the perfect symmetry of the stones placed around the skulls. Stones carved with symbols that resembled nothing in his experience. Within 45 minutes, the renovation site had transformed. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and men in dark windbreakers conversed in hushed tones near the prison's main entrance. The workers had been sequestered in the old cafeteria, their tools abandoned around the hole like discarded toys. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived as the afternoon fog began rolling across the bay. She stepped off the tourist ferry, archaeological kit in hand, trying to ignore the chill that had nothing to do with the notorious San Francisco weather. The text message from her department chair had been cryptic, but urgent. "Alcatraz archaeological emergency. Your expertise needed immediately. Discretion essential." The military escort waiting at the dock didn't improve her unease. The young soldier's face remained impassive as he led her through the throngs of oblivious tourists, past the gift shop selling mock prison uniforms and miniature cell block replicas, and into the restricted section where the renovation had been underway. "We've cleared the site, ma'am," he said, the first words he'd spoken since meeting her. "The discovery is unusual." "What kind of unusual?" Elena asked, adjusting her glasses. Her specialty was pre-colonial Pacific Coast cultures. What could possibly warrant pulling her from her lecture preparations with such urgency? Instead of answering, he unlocked a heavy door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" and gestured for her to enter. The contrast between the bustling tourist areas and the abandoned worksite struck her immediately. Tools lay scattered as if dropped in panic. The generator hummed in the corner, powering stark floodlights that created harsh shadows against the peeling paint of the prison walls, and at the center of it all the hole, a perfect dark circle punched through the concrete floor. "We need your assessment before deciding how to proceed," said a voice behind her. Eleanor turned to find a tall man in civilian clothes, though his bearing screamed military. "I'm Howard Lynch, Department of Interior." The credentials he flashed said otherwise, but Elena didn't comment. Instead, she approached the hole cautiously, kneeling at its edge. The floodlights had been positioned to illuminate what lay beneath, revealing what had caused the workers to flee. Elena's breath caught. The circular arrangement of human remains was unmistakable. Ritual placement, not a mass grave. The bones had the dark patina of extreme age, but their arrangement was perfectly preserved, as if they had been sealed away from the elements for centuries. The stones placed at cardinal points around the circle bore markings that sent her mind racing through mental catalogues of indigenous symbolism. "How old is this building section?" she asked, already pulling on latex gloves from her kit. "This wing was constructed in 1910, Lynch replied, watching her closely. "Before the federal prison, this was a military fortification dating back to the 1850s. Elena nodded absently, her focus narrowing to the symbols etched into the stones. They weren't consistent with any Coast Miwok or Ohlone patterns she recognized. The precision of the carving suggested tools beyond what was typically attributed to pre-colonial indigenous peoples of the region. "I need to get down there," she said, already reaching for her camera. Lynch stepped forward. "Before you do, Dr. Vasquez, I need to be clear. This discovery is now classified. Whatever you find, whatever theories you develop, remain the property of the United States government." Elena looked up sharply, catching something in his expression that sent a different kind of chill through her. Not fear of the unknown, but something more immediate. The realization that she was being drawn into something where archaeological truth might not be the primary concern. "I understand," she lied, turning back to the hole. As she prepared to descend into the darkness, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold that extended beyond the physical. The prison above had held America's most notorious criminals, but what lay beneath might imprison something far more dangerous. Truth. The cold air rising from the opening seemed to carry whispers of the past, a past that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal beneath layers of concrete and steel. A past that was never meant to be unearthed. Elena crouched at the edge of the excavation, her headlamp cutting through the darkness as she meticulously photographed each stone surrounding the skeletal arrangement. The symbols resembled no indigenous writing system she recognized, not Ohlone, not Coast Miwok, not any documented pre-colonial culture from the region. The precision of the carving suggested tools that shouldn't have existed here, not centuries ago. "These markings appear almost deliberate," she murmured to her assistant, David Chen, a graduate student who'd been summoned from Berkeley hours after her arrival. "Not ceremonial abstractions, but something closer to a written language." David nodded, his face pale in the artificial light. "The arrangement is too methodical for ritual burial practices of known indigenous groups." Eleanor ran her gloved fingers along one stone's edge, feeling the perfect geometric grooves. Though eroded by time, the circular patterns maintained a mathematical precision that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. These weren't merely symbolic, they were communicative, like pages from a book written in stone. "What's strange," she said, shifting to examine another artifact, "is how the symbols connect across different stones, creating continuous lines when properly aligned." David photographed the observation, careful to document the spatial relationships. Almost like they were meant to be read as a single text. The wind howled through Alcatraz's abandoned corridors, creating a low, persistent moan that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The prison's metal infrastructure contracted in the evening chill, producing irregular metallic groans that punctuated their work with unsettling frequency. After 6 hours of initial documentation, Eleanor requested access to the island's historical archives. The government agent, Lynch, provided a thin folder with suspiciously sparse information. "This is all we have on pre-prison history?" Elena questioned, flipping through the meager pages that barely covered the military fortification period, let alone anything earlier. "The island's documented history begins with Spanish exploration in the 1700s, Lynch replied flatly. "Anything before that is largely speculative." The security guard assigned to accompany them shifted uncomfortably whenever they approached the excavation site, maintaining his distance from the hole while pretending to check his phone. His discomfort was palpable, a visceral reaction that transcended simple superstition. That night, Elena converted a former guard's quarters into an impromptu research station. The cramped room with its institutional green walls and barred windows became a makeshift laboratory as she reviewed enlarged photographs of the stone markings under harsh fluorescent lighting. At 2:47 a.m., staring at high-resolution images on her laptop screen, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among the intricate circular patterns and angular lines was a sequence that bore unmistakable resemblance to Latin characters, not random similarity, but deliberate formation. The implications were staggering. These markings suggested contact with European writing systems long before any documented arrival of Spanish explorers in California. She closed her laptop with trembling hands, suddenly aware of the weight of what she might have discovered. If verified, this finding would challenge the established timeline of North American contact history. The academic establishment would resist, government interests would intervene, and her own reputation would be scrutinized with ruthless intensity. Elena moved to the barred window, gazing across the dark waters of San Francisco Bay at the city lights shimmering in the distance. The prison walls around her now felt less like protection and more like containment. Whatever lay beneath Alcatraz had remained hidden for centuries for a reason, and she was suddenly acutely aware that bringing it to light might come at a cost she wasn't prepared to pay. As the laptop's blue indicator light blinked in the darkened room, Elena realized she stood at a crossroads: continue down this path of discovery with its unknown consequences, or step back into the safety of conventional archaeology and established history. The symbols from below seemed to have etched themselves into her mind, impossible to unsee or unlearn. The choice was already made, though she hadn't acknowledged it yet. Some truths, once glimpsed, demand to be revealed, regardless of the price. The conference room in Alcatraz's administrative block had been converted into an impromptu command center. Elena arrived at 8:15 a.m. to find 3 men in dark suits already waiting. Their government-issue laptops and satellite phones created an incongruous scene against the peeling paint and rust-stained walls of the historic prison. Dr. Vasquez, the oldest of the 3, greeted her with outstanding. "I'm Director Hargrove, Department of Historical Preservation." His credentials, flashed briefly, suggested otherwise. "These are my colleagues, Mr. Peterson and Dr. Kamal." Elena recognized the calculated intimidation tactic. 3 of them, one of her, seated while she stood. She placed her research folder on the table and remained standing. "Your preliminary findings," Hargrove continued, "suggest an anomalous archaeological discovery." His tone made anomalous sound like problematic. "The arrangement of artifacts predates known colonial settlement," Elena stated firmly. "The markings display characteristics inconsistent with documented indigenous cultures of this region." Peterson, the youngest of the 3, leaned forward. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Doctor?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm gathering evidence." Elena kept her voice steady despite the defensiveness rising in her throat. "Science requires observation before conclusion." Dr. Kamal, who had remained silent, opened a leather portfolio. "Your academic record shows a particular interest in pre-Columbian contact theories." His accent was faintly British, his tone clinical. "Publications that some colleagues find speculative." The implication was clear. They had already researched her, assessed her credibility, and found it wanting. They weren't here for archaeological consultation. They were conducting a threat assessment. "My peer-reviewed work speaks for itself," Elena replied, feeling sweat forming along her hairline despite the room's chill. "What concerns me more is the apparent removal of historical documentation about this island." Hargrove's expression didn't change. "All relevant materials have been provided." "Relevant according to whom?" The words escaped before Eleanor could filter them. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds too long. "Dr. Vasquez," Hargrove finally said, "this site is now classified under Section 107 of the National Security Archaeological Protocol. Your findings, methods, and conclusions are subject to review before any publication or dissemination." Elena had never heard of such a protocol. "I wasn't aware archaeology fell under national security jurisdiction." "It doesn't typically," Peterson added, with a tight smile that conveyed the opposite of reassurance. "This is an exception." After the meeting, Elena returned to the excavation site to find it transformed. Black tarps now covered the opening, military personnel stood guard, and a narrow observation platform had been constructed, restricting access to a small viewing area above the discovery. The open archaeological site had become a controlled military operation overnight. The soldier who checked her credentials avoided eye contact. "One person at a time on the platform, ma'am. 20 minutes maximum." Standing on the metal grating, looking down at what had been an unrestricted workspace just yesterday, Elena felt a crushing sense of constraint. The bones and stones remained untouched, but the freedom to investigate had been clinically excised from the process. This was no longer her discovery, it was her assignment. That evening, Eleanor found an unmarked manila envelope under her door. Inside was a yellowed map of San Francisco Bay dated 1847, predating the prison construction. Alcatraz Island was marked with a circular symbol, identical to those found on the stones below the prison floor. At the bottom margin, partially erased but visible under her desk lamp, "Built not to imprison, but to conceal." Elena's heart raced as she examined the document. The handwriting was faded, but unmistakably not contemporary. This wasn't someone's idea of a practical joke. It was primary source material that hadn't been included in the complete archives she'd been provided. She realized then that she wasn't the first to discover the secret beneath Alcatraz, and those who had found it before her had faced the same shadowy opposition now gathering around her work. The San Francisco History Museum stood as a neoclassical counterpoint to the city's modern skyline, its stone columns and broad steps projecting institutional authority. Elena arrived early, slipping past morning tour groups to reach the archives department in the basement level. "I called ahead," she told the archivist, a silver-haired woman whose name tag read, "Margaret. I'm researching pre-prison history of Alcatraz Island." Margaret's eyes flickered with interest. "Colonial or pre-colonial?" "Both, if possible, especially early Spanish records." The archivist led Elena through temperature-controlled rooms to a research table where several document boxes awaited. "Most official records begin with the military fortification in the 1850s, Margaret explained. "Earlier accounts are fragmentary at best." Elena nodded, already pulling on cotton gloves to examine the fragile papers. "I'm interested in those fragments." For 3 hours, she pored over faded journals, correspondence, and maps. The Spanish explorers had named the island Isla de los Alcatraces, Island of the Pelicans, but references to the landmass appeared strangely inconsistent in navigational records. Ships' logs mentioned avoiding the island entirely, despite its strategic position in the bay. In a translated account from 1775, a Spanish sailor wrote, "The natives will not approach the cursed island." When questioned, they speak of ancient prohibitions and point to the fires sometimes seen at night, figures moving in circles upon its shores. The captain forbids landing there, though some claim it would make an excellent defensive position. Elena photographed the passage with her phone, her pulse quickening. A territorial taboo among indigenous peoples wasn't uncommon, but combined with what she'd found beneath the prison floor, each historical thread gained new significance. More troubling were the gaps, expeditions that should have documented the island but didn't, maps where the island appeared with different dimensions or positions, colonial accounts that contradicted each other about when the first Europeans actually set foot there. By early afternoon, Elena had compiled enough discrepancies to suggest a pattern of historical uncertainty surrounding Alcatraz, as if the island's documentation had been deliberately obfuscated even before the prison's construction. "Finding what you need?" Margaret asked, bringing tea in a museum-branded mug. Finding what's missing might be more accurate, Eleanor replied, accepting the drink gratefully. There seems to be a curious lack of consistency in how Alcatraz was documented. The archivist's expression shifted subtly. Places accumulate myths when they're isolated, islands especially. She hesitated, then added, I've always found it odd that they built America's most notorious prison on such a small island. Logistically challenging, expensive, almost deliberate in its impracticality. Back on Alcatraz that evening, Eleanor explored the maintenance tunnels beneath the main cell block, where the renovation had exposed older structural elements. Her flashlight illuminated crumbling concrete, rusted pipes, and deeper down, stone walls that predated the prison construction. The sound of water striking the foundation created a rhythmic backdrop as she examined the older stonework. Unlike the uniform prison architecture, these walls showed irregular patterns and construction techniques inconsistent with military fortification standards. Some sections appeared to have been built around existing formations rather than according to a unified design. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the underground chill as she traced mortar lines that were clearly older than anything documented in the official history. The prison hadn't simply been built on the island, it had been integrated with whatever structure preceded it. Rounding a corner, Eleanor discovered a section where recent seismic retrofitting had exposed the junction between modern concrete and ancient stonework. The older construction extended deeper into the bedrock, suggesting that what she was seeing was merely the upper portion of a more extensive foundation. The implication struck her with physical force. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary wasn't just built on the island. It was built to incorporate and conceal a pre-existing structure. The prison's reputation as inescapable might have been deliberately cultivated to ensure no one dug too deeply into its foundations. Standing in the damp tunnel, Elena felt professional certainty warring with instinctive doubt. The evidence before her eyes suggested a historical conspiracy of staggering proportions. But the academic establishment would demand irrefutable proof before accepting such a radical revision of established colonial chronology. And if the government's involvement was any indication, she might never be permitted to present whatever evidence she uncovered. The weight of this realization pressed against her chest like the island itself, immovable, isolating, and increasingly inescapable. Eleanor spread her notes across the metal desk in her temporary quarters, organizing chronologies and cross-referencing findings. The pattern was becoming clearer: historical inconsistencies, architectural anomalies, and now the undeniable evidence beneath the prison floor. She reached for her research journal, only to find the most recent pages missing. "David," she called out, a cold sensation creeping along her spine. Her assistant entered, his posture tense, eyes avoiding hers. "Have you seen my field notes from yesterday?" He shifted his weight from one foot to another. "Elena, I need to tell you something." The confession spilled out awkwardly. The military liaison had approached him yesterday, offering exclusive access to classified archaeological sites in exchange for copies of Elena's documentation. A career-making opportunity, they'd said. Future funding guaranteed. The implication clear: cooperate or be blacklisted. "I gave them copies of everything," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Your journals, photographs, preliminary analyses." Eleanor stared at him, the betrayal crystallizing like ice in her chest. Not just a colleague, her student, someone she'd mentored for 3 years. "Get out," she said quietly, the controlled tone requiring more effort than shouting would have. "They were going to take it anyway," David countered, desperation edging into his voice. "At least this way one of us might continue the research. Under their conditions, their narrative." Elena's hands trembled as she gathered her remaining papers. "That's not research, David. That's propaganda." After he left, Eleanor pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the pressure building behind them. This wasn't just academic rivalry or professional jealousy. Forces with resources and authority were actively working to control her discovery. The realization made the cramped room feel even smaller, the barred windows suddenly more prison than protection. That evening, Eleanor slipped past the security checkpoint using her still valid credentials and made her way to the excavation site. The changes stopped her cold. New equipment surrounded the pit, and fresh soil disturbance indicated recent activity. Someone had expanded the excavation in her absence, removing materials without documentation or proper archaeological protocol. She approached the edge, noting drag marks where heavy objects had been extracted and loaded onto what must have been wheeled transport. Military efficiency had replaced scientific methodology. The systematic destruction of context, the cardinal sin of archaeology, had been committed with calculated precision. "They moved everything last night," came a voice behind her. The site foreman, Reeves, stood in the shadows, cigarette glowing between his fingers. Black cases with military markings. "No manifests, no paperwork." "Did you see what they took?" Eleanor asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "More bones, stones with those same markings. They cut right through the concrete in sections rather than breaking it." He exhaled smoke that caught the security lighting. "One thing I know from 20 years in construction, when someone cuts that clean, they're hiding the evidence." Eleanor photographed the disturbance with her phone, documenting the desecration of the site. Each image felt like documented proof of her own powerlessness. Whatever had been removed was now beyond her reach, disappeared into classified storage or worse, destroyed to prevent further investigation. She returned to her quarters and pulled out the antique map she'd received anonymously. The circular marking on Alcatraz now seemed less mysterious and more accusatory. Someone before her had discovered this secret, tried to document it, and likely faced the same opposition she now confronted. The map wasn't just evidence, it was a warning passed through time. The crushing weight of institutional power pressed against her academic integrity. If she continued pursuing the truth, her career and reputation would be systematically dismantled. If she accepted the official narrative, she would become complicit in historical erasure. In that moment of clarity, something hardened within Elena. Determination crystallized from disillusionment. They had taken her evidence, compromised her assistant, and controlled the physical site, but they couldn't take the knowledge already locked in her mind. The truth about what lay beneath Alcatraz still existed, and someone had risked everything to ensure she found it. She would not be the one to break that chain of discovery, regardless of the personal cost. The map trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear now, but from resolve. The circular symbol seemed to pulse with urgency, as if affirming her decision to fight against forces determined to bury history beneath concrete and classification. Rain hammered against Alcatraz like a furious sea, transforming the island into a fortress surrounded by twin moats of water, bay below, sky above. Helena used the downpour as cover, moving through the prison's administrative wing with deliberate steps, counting doorways until she reached the maintenance access panel Reeves had described. The rusted metal gave way with a protesting groan that the storm mercifully concealed. Flashlight gripped between her teeth, Elena lowered herself into the narrow utility shaft, her rain-slicked boots finding precarious purchase on corroded rungs. The tight space reeked of salt, rust, and decades of neglect, institutional decay preserved rather than remedied. At the bottom, a horizontal tunnel stretched before her, barely tall enough to stand in. Decades-old electrical conduits snaked along the ceiling like fossilized veins, feeding into junction boxes crusted with mineral deposits. Eleanor advanced methodically, noting how the tunnel's construction changed as she progressed. Concrete giving way to brick, then to fitted stone that matched what she documented beneath the excavation site. After 30 meters, the passage intersected with a ventilation duct. Through this opening, she squeezed into a chamber that had clearly never appeared on any official prison blueprint. The room was perfectly square, its walls comprised of massive stone blocks that predated modern masonry techniques. Eleanor's flashlight beam revealed ceiling heights impossible to reconcile with the known foundation plans of Alcatraz. "This shouldn't exist," she whispered to herself, the sound absorbed by the ancient walls. In the center of the chamber, partially obscured by collapsed debris, lay a massive stone slab. Elena cleared away the smaller fragments, revealing what had been hidden beneath the prison for centuries. A stone tablet covered with inscriptions identical to those found at the excavation site, but on a scale that suggested a complete text rather than fragments. The markings extended across the entire surface in concentric patterns, spiraling from the center outward. This wasn't merely a symbolic representation. It was a codex, a written record preserved in stone. Elena's hands shook as she photographed each section, methodically documenting what appeared to be a chronological narrative. The symbols included astronomical configurations, migration patterns, and what looked disturbingly like European ships, all preserved in stone centuries before official contact. Between these depictions were the same Latin-like characters she'd identified earlier, not random similarities, but deliberate written language combining indigenous and European elements. Elena traced the spiral pattern with her finger, following the narrative flow. The markings documented solar eclipses, seasonal shifts, and population movements with mathematical precision. More disturbing were the references to disasters, disease outbreaks, conflicts, disappearances of entire communities, all recorded with dispassionate accuracy. As she worked outward from the center, Elena encountered names and dates that shouldn't exist in pre-colonial context. European identifiers recorded decades before official discovery. The implication was staggering. This stone documented contact and exchange between indigenous peoples and Europeans long before the accepted historical timeline. "You've gone beyond your clearance, Dr. Vasquez." The voice startled her so violently she nearly dropped her camera. Lynch stood in the ventilation duct opening, flanked by 2 military personnel. Their flashlights caught her in a crossfire of harsh white beams. "This chamber is restricted. You're trespassing on a classified site." Elena's mind raced through possible responses, settling on the only one that mattered. "This evidence predates your jurisdiction by centuries. It belongs to history, not national security." Lynch's expression remained impassive. "All findings at this site fall under Section 107 Protocol. Your unauthorized documentation constitutes a breach." The soldiers moved forward, efficiently securing the chamber. One photographed Elena's position, while the other began unpacking equipment, clearly designed for artifact removal. The codex would be boxed, transported, and likely disappeared into some government warehouse. History erased with bureaucratic precision. "I can't just bury this," Elena protested as they escorted her toward the exit. "This changes everything we know about pre-colonial contact." "That," Lynch replied coldly, "is precisely the problem." As they emerged into the storm-lashed prison yard, Elena caught a final glimpse of soldiers carrying the stone codex in a specialized container, its ancient surface already disappearing under protective wrapping. The rain washed away her boot prints from the maintenance tunnel, erasing evidence of her discovery, just as thoroughly as the government was erasing the discovery itself. The truth had been within her grasp for a fleeting moment, documented, photographed, witnessed. Now it was being systematically removed, reclassified, hidden once again beneath layers of concrete and secrecy. The interrogation room at the Federal Building in San Francisco bore a sterile uniformity that transcended decades. Bland walls, uncomfortable chairs, and the same one-way mirror found in every government facility since the Cold War. Elena sat rigidly, her academic credentials now reduced to a visitor badge clipped to her jacket. "Your unauthorized exploration compromised a classified archaeological site," stated the woman across from her, whose ID badge read only Richards, Department of Historical Oversight, an agency Elena had never heard of before today. "We need to understand exactly what you saw and documented." "I saw evidence of pre-Columbian contact that contradicts established historical timelines," Elena replied, maintaining eye contact despite her racing pulse. "Evidence that was being systematically removed without proper archaeological documentation." Richards made a note without looking up. "And you believe this evidence supports what theory exactly?" The trap was evident. Anything she said would be used to discredit her professionally. Suggest too radical a revision of history, and she'd be labeled a fringe theorist. Understate the implications, and they'd bury the findings as insignificant. "I believe," Elena chose her words carefully, "that the artifacts indicate cultural exchange between indigenous peoples and European explorers, significantly predating official contact records. The codex contained astronomical data, migration patterns, and linguistic elements that deserve proper scientific examination." "Examination that you conducted without authorization," interjected a man, who had been silently observing from the corner. His suit was better tailored than the others, his presence commanding immediate attention when he finally spoke. "You understand the position this puts us in, Dr. Vasquez. National security concerns require discretion." "Archaeological discoveries aren't national security matters," Elena countered. "They become security matters when they threaten to destabilize established historical frameworks," he replied, his tone suggesting he was explaining something obvious. "Consider the geopolitical implications, land claims, heritage rights, cultural ownership disputes. History isn't just knowledge, Dr. Vasquez, it's power." The reality of her situation crystallized with brutal clarity. This wasn't about protecting archaeological integrity or even controlling scientific discovery. It was about maintaining the authority to define America's origin story. Who came first? Who discovered whom? Whose narrative deserved prominence? "Your academic standing is exceptional," Richards continued, sliding a document across the table. "It would be unfortunate to see that compromised by publication of unverifiable claims based on evidence you no longer have access to." The document outlined conditions for her continued work: non-disclosure agreements, government oversight of future publications, and carefully worded statements about the Alcatraz findings that aligned with conventional history. The final paragraph detailed the consequences of non-compliance: funding revocation, peer review challenges, media discreditation. "You're asking me to lie," Elena said, her voice barely audible. "We're asking you to consider the bigger picture," the man corrected smoothly. "Your career, your reputation, your ability to continue working in your field." Elena left the federal building 3 hours later with a pounding headache and a signed agreement she already regretted. The weight of compromise sat like lead in her stomach as she navigated the city streets, every pedestrian seeming like a potential observer monitoring her movements. Back in her apartment overlooking the bay, Eleanor drew the blinds and sat in darkness, the distant lights of Alcatraz visible as a small cluster of yellow dots floating on the black water. The island that had once represented her greatest discovery now symbolized her greatest failure, her inability to protect historical truth against institutional power. A soft knock at her door startled her from contemplation. Through the peephole, she recognized David, his expression haunted by the same compromised principles that tormented her. "I shouldn't be here," he said when she opened the door, glancing nervously down the hallway. "But I couldn't." He thrust a flash drive into her hand. "I made copies before giving them the originals, photos of the codex, translations I started. The military's initial assessment reports that they didn't know I saw." Eleanor stared at the small device, a technological David against an institutional Goliath. "They'll know it came from you," she warned. David's eyes reflected resignation already processed. "They already suspect, but they can't erase what's been documented, only control who sees it." He turned to leave, then hesitated. "The choice about what to do with it isn't mine anymore. It's yours." After he left, Elena held the flash drive like a live coal, potentially destructive, yet containing vital energy. The data it held represented a decision point between professional survival and historical truth, between personal safety and collective knowledge. From her window, Alcatraz loomed in the distance, its silhouette sharp against the night sky, a monument to containment where America's most dangerous individuals had been isolated from society. Now it contained perhaps its most dangerous secret, evidence that the narrative of discovery and conquest that underpinned American identity was built on selective history. The last ferry to Alcatraz carried mostly maintenance staff and a solitary figure in a dark raincoat. Elena had used her still valid credentials one final time, claiming the need to collect personal equipment. The guard at the dock barely glanced at her ID, his attention focused on the approaching storm front, darkening the horizon. Walking the perimeter path, Eleanor traced the island's edge where 19th century fortifications met natural rock formations. The true significance of this location had crystallized during her sleepless night, reviewing David's stolen files. Alcatraz wasn't chosen for its isolation alone. It was selected precisely because something already existed here, something that needed containment. She paused at the exact spot where the original excavation had broken through the prison floor. The area had been professionally restored, concrete poured and set with such precision that no casual observer would notice the disturbance. The physical evidence had been erased with the same methodical thoroughness used to sanitize historical records. Standing there, Eleanor recorded a quiet audio note on her phone. The strategic value of Alcatraz was never primarily military or penal. Its true purpose was containment of historical evidence, a prison built not to keep people in, but to keep truth buried. The coordinates from the antique map had led her to this precise spot. Someone generations ago had marked this location, knowing what lay beneath. That unknown predecessor had faced the same crisis of conscience she now confronted, the knowledge that America's foundation mythology rested upon deliberately obscured history. Her phone vibrated with a text from an international number. Secure server ready. Limited window. Her colleague at Cambridge had prepared the academic dead drop as promised. Once uploaded, the evidence would exist beyond American jurisdiction, accessible to researchers worldwide. Eleanor looked out across the bay toward San Francisco's glittering skyline. The city represented the endpoint of America's westward expansion, the fulfillment of manifest destiny. How would that narrative change if evidence proved Europeans had already established contact here centuries before, creating hybrid written languages with indigenous peoples that were later systematically erased? She connected to the maintenance building's Wi-Fi using the password from David's files. The upload began. Photographs of the codex, translations, contextual evidence, and her comprehensive analysis. With each passing percentage point, Elena felt the weight of decision pressing against her chest. This action would irreversibly alter her life, ending her career while potentially rewriting history. A notification appeared. Upload complete. Somewhere across the Atlantic, a server now contained evidence that would raise profound questions about pre-Columbian contact and the deliberate suppression of historical artifacts that contradicted official narratives. Elena deleted the confirmation message and powered down her phone. The digital trail ended here, but her personal connection to the discovery remained. She would never receive academic recognition, never publish her findings in peer-reviewed journals, never stand before colleagues explaining the significance of what lay beneath Alcatraz. Her victory would remain anonymous, her vindication existing only in knowing that truth had escaped containment. Some other researcher would eventually access the server, examine the evidence, and continue the investigation, perhaps with greater institutional protection or in a different political climate. The last ferry horn sounded its departure warning. Eleanor took one final look at the prison building silhouetted against the darkening sky, America's most notorious penitentiary, constructed above America's most carefully hidden archaeological site. The symmetry was perfect, a monument to containment serving dual purposes across centuries. As she boarded the ferry, Elena noticed a black SUV pulling up to the dock. Men in suits emerged, speaking urgently into communication devices. Someone had detected the upload. The timing would be close. The boat pulled away from the island as the men reached the dock, too late to prevent her departure. Elena stood at the rail, watching Alcatraz recede into the distance. The prison complex that had housed America's most infamous criminals had also imprisoned its most inconvenient historical truth, a truth now released into academic circulation beyond any single government's control. The ferry cut through the choppy waters of San Francisco Bay, carrying Elena toward an uncertain future. Behind her, Alcatraz stood as it always had, imposing, isolated, and secretive. But its power to contain was broken. Whatever consequences awaited her personally, the archaeological evidence had escaped, slipping through institutional fingers like the water surrounding the island fortress. Some truths could be buried but never truly contained, not when individuals chose documentation over silence, evidence over comfort, historical integrity over personal safety. In that knowledge, Eleanor found a measure of peace as the island disappeared into the gathering darkness. The story of what lies beneath Alcatraz reminds us that history is written not just by those who lived it, but by those who control its narrative. Elena Vasquez faced the ultimate dilemma: that many of us may encounter in our lives, the choice between personal safety and a larger truth. What would you have done in her position? Would you have accepted the comfortable lie, preserved your career, and let buried secrets remain entombed? Or would you have risked everything to ensure that historical truth escaped its prison of concrete and classification? Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this tale isn't what was discovered beneath Alcatraz, but how easily institutional power can reshape our understanding of the past. The foundations upon which we build our national identities may rest on carefully constructed narratives rather than complete historical records. Elena's journey forces us to question what other truths might remain buried beneath the weight of official histories and convenient narratives, not just beneath prisons, but within our accepted understanding of who we are and how we came to be. If you found yourself captivated by this archaeological mystery, consider sharing it with others who appreciate stories that challenge our perception of history. Subscribe to see more explorations of hidden histories, forgotten places, and the secrets that powerful institutions would prefer remained buried. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that almost went untold.